Waves roll black under a moon that looks tired. No thunder of bombs, no silver streak of torpedoes, just silence. And then the quiet crack of radio static, the hum of diesel engines far below the surface. April 1944. Somewhere between Luzon and Formosa, a Japanese oil tanker named Nisho Maru cuts through dark water, heavy with crude oil bound for Yokosuka. Her captain doesn't know that 300 feet below, USS Harder is tracking every turn of his propeller. No grand duel happens here, no heroic broadside. Just patience, mathematics, and one brutal realization. You don't kill a navy by sinking its battleships, you kill it by starving its engines. In 1944, the most feared fleet in the Pacific did not fall in a blaze of glory. It died quietly, one tanker at a time, choking on empty fuel lines while admirals screamed into radios and pilots watched their Zeros rust at airfields. The Imperial Japanese Navy, architects of Pearl Harbor, masters of carrier warfare, was dismantled not by superior firepower, but by a forgotten strategy so simple it sounds absurd. Cut the oil, and the steel giants become tombs. This is the story of how America's silent service broke Japan's backbone without firing a single shot at its greatest ships. If you love the untold strategies hidden behind history's headlines, hit subscribe, because what comes next will change how you see the entire Pacific War. To understand how a navy dies of thirst, you must first understand how desperately Japan needed to drink. In 1941, the Japanese Empire controlled almost no domestic oil, zero meaningful petroleum reserves. Every drop of fuel that powered the Kido Butai, every gallon that fed the Mitsubishi factories, every barrel that kept the war machine alive, it all came from somewhere else. Borneo, Sumatra, the Dutch East Indies. When Japan struck Pearl Harbor, it wasn't madness. It was mathematics. The United States had cut off oil exports in 1940, an economic stranglehold that gave Tokyo a choice. Surrender its ambitions in China and Southeast Asia, or seize the oil fields by force before the reserves ran dry. They chose war. And for 18 months it worked. Japanese forces swept across the Pacific, capturing refineries in Palembang, Tarakan, and Balikpapan. Oil flowed. The empire breathed. But there was a fatal flaw in the equation. A vulnerability so obvious that American strategists saw it immediately. Japan could pump all the oil it wanted, but it still had to ship it home. Across 2,000 miles of open ocean, through narrow straits, past contested islands. And beneath those waves, American submarines were waiting. In December 1941, the U.S. submarine fleet was a broken instrument. The boats themselves, Gato-class, Tambor-class, were engineering marvels, diesel-electric predators capable of diving to 300 feet and staying submerged for hours. But they carried a fatal curse, the Mark 14 torpedo, a weapon so flawed it bordered on sabotage. Submariners watched in agony as torpedoes ran too deep, passing harmlessly beneath enemy hulls. Magnetic detonators triggered prematurely, exploding in the wake instead of the target. Contact exploders failed to fire even on direct hits. In one documented case, USS Tainosa fired 15 torpedoes at a stationary Japanese tanker. 11 hit. None exploded. The Bureau of Ordnance refused to believe the problem existed. They blamed the crews, blamed the commanders, blamed everything except their own design. It took 2 years of furious field reports, unauthorized testing by submarine captains, and finally intervention from Admiral Charles Lockwood before the torpedoes were fixed. By mid-1943, the Mark 14 finally worked. The submarines had their fangs back. And the Imperial Japanese Navy was about to discover what happened when you built an empire on borrowed oil, and the supply line turned into a killing field. The hunt was about to begin. Japan's logistical nightmare was painted in ink across every naval chart. From the oil fields of Borneo to the refineries of Yokosuka stretched a fragile thread of sea lanes, choke points, and convoy routes that had to remain open or the empire would suffocate. Approximately 80% of Japan's oil came by tanker. No tankers, no fuel. No fuel, no navy. No navy, no empire. American intelligence watched this lifeline with predatory focus. Codebreakers at Station Hypo and OP-20G intercepted Japanese convoy schedules, decoded routing orders, tracked every tanker's departure and destination. They knew when ships left port, what they carried, and where they would be 3 days later. It was like reading the enemy's diary before they wrote it. Submarine commanders received their orders in sealed packets, grid coordinates, ship silhouettes, predicted courses. The directive was clear and cold. Prioritize tankers above all else. Let the destroyers pass. Ignore the troop transports if you must, but if you see a tanker, you sink it. The strategy had a name among the submariners, grim and efficient: Operation Strangulation. And it was about to turn the Pacific into a graveyard for Japanese fuel. The submarines went to work like surgical instruments. USS Harder, USS Tang, USS Wahoo, names that would become legends among submariners and nightmares in Tokyo. They patrolled the South China Sea, the Luzon Strait, the approaches to the Celebes, waiting in the shipping lanes like wolves at a mountain pass. A typical attack unfolded in silence. The submarine would detect the convoy by sound first. The rhythmic thump of freighter engines carried for miles underwater. The captain would maneuver into position, bringing the boat to periscope depth in the pre-dawn darkness. Through the narrow lens, he'd identify his target. Low in the water, riding heavy with cargo. A tanker. The words would pass quietly through the boat. "We have a fat one." Torpedoes away. The crew would count the seconds. Impact. The dull boom transmitted through the water, felt in the chest before heard in the ears. Then the sound of rending metal, the hiss of escaping steam, the groan of a ship dying. And then, critically, the submarine would dive deep and vanish before the escort destroyers could respond. No glory, no witnesses, just another tanker slipping beneath the waves, and Japan's oil supply bleeding one more wound. By late 1943, the pattern became undeniable. Japanese tanker losses weren't just increasing, they were accelerating into catastrophe. In 1942, submarines sank 19 tankers. In 1943, that number jumped to 38. In 1944, it would reach 60. The math was brutal. Japan needed approximately 10 million barrels of oil per month to sustain military operations. Each sunken tanker represented weeks of fuel lost, irreplaceable tonnage, crews that couldn't be retrained fast enough. The Imperial Navy tried everything: convoy systems with destroyer escorts, routing changes through different waters, timing departures with weather fronts to hide in storms, night sailing, radio silence, zigzag patterns. Nothing worked. The submarines adjusted faster than the convoys could adapt. When the Japanese added more escorts, the submarines simply waited for the escorts to pass, then struck the vulnerable tankers from behind. One submarine captain described it coldly. "It's like shooting cattle. They know we're here. They know what we're doing. But they have to bring the oil home, so they keep coming." And the submarines kept killing. In Tokyo, fuel reserves dropped from comfortable to concerning to critical. Fleet commanders began hoarding supplies, rationing fuel for capital ships, canceling training exercises. The mighty Yamato, largest battleship ever built, sat motionless at Kure, too precious to risk on fuel it didn't have. The human cost multiplied in ways statistics couldn't capture. When a tanker went down, most of the crew went with it. Oil burns at high temperature when mixed with seawater and ignited by torpedo explosions. Survivors described the ocean turning into liquid fire, flames spreading across the surface, men swimming through burning petroleum that stuck to skin and hair. But the submarines couldn't stop. The calculus was merciless. Every tanker that reached Japan extended the war. Every tanker sunk brought peace closer. Submarine commanders wrote in their logs with clinical detachment. Tanker sunk, all hands lost, proceeded to next patrol area. They had to. Sentiment was a luxury when nations were burning. Meanwhile, Japanese Naval Command faced an impossible equation. They could concentrate escorts on tanker convoys, but that left troop transports vulnerable. They could send tankers in large, heavily defended groups, but that created predictable schedules the Americans could intercept and decode. They could scatter the tankers and hope for better odds, but that exposed each ship to lone submarine attacks. Every solution created new vulnerabilities. Every tactical adjustment was met with American counter-adjustment within weeks. The Imperial Navy was playing chess against an opponent who could see 3 moves ahead because they'd already read the playbook. And the fuel gauge kept dropping. By early 1944, the consequences rippled through every level of Japanese military operations. Fighter pilots trained on minimal fuel allotments, sometimes as little as 1 hour of flight time per week. Veteran pilots died not in combat, but in training accidents caused by insufficient practice. New pilots arrived at combat squadrons with barely enough experience to land safely, let alone dogfight American Hellcats. The surface fleet began cannibalizing its own mobility. Fuel was transferred from destroyers to cruisers, from cruisers to battleships, concentrating dwindling reserves in fewer ships. The result? A navy that couldn't deploy its full strength even when battle was necessary. During the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, Japanese carriers launched strikes knowing their planes wouldn't have fuel to return if the battle lasted too long. Pilots were told to ditch near friendly islands and hope for rescue. It wasn't just shortage, it was triage. Every gallon of fuel became a command decision. Do we train pilots or do we keep destroyers operational? Do we send a rescue mission or conserve fuel for the next offensive? The submarines had done more than sink ships. They'd turned Japan's entire war machine into a vehicle running on fumes, making desperate choices, burning its future to survive the present. The breaking point came in October 1944 during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval engagement in history. The Imperial Japanese Navy assembled its remaining strength for one final desperate gamble: crush the American landing forces in the Philippines or lose the war. It was the moment they'd prepared for, the decisive battle they'd designed their entire fleet to win. But they couldn't get there. Admiral Kurita's center force, including the super battleship Yamato, had to refuel 3 times just to reach the battle area. Fuel tankers were positioned at specific coordinates, exposed and vulnerable, while the fleet stopped dead in submarine-infested waters to take on oil. The southern force under Admiral Nishimura ran so low on fuel they couldn't execute evasive maneuvers when American destroyers attacked in Surrogate Strait. They had to sail straight lines, predictable and doomed. Most devastating, Vice Admiral Ozawa's carrier force launched strikes with barely enough fuel for one-way missions. Pilots knew it. They flew anyway. 90% never returned. The Japanese won several tactical victories at Leyte Gulf. They damaged American ships. They sank escort carriers. But at the climax, Admiral Kurita, with the American landing force at his mercy, turned back. Multiple reasons influenced his decision, but one was undeniable. He didn't have the fuel for a prolonged engagement. The battle Japan needed to win, it couldn't afford to fight. In November 1944, the U.S. submarine campaign achieved something unprecedented in naval warfare: complete strategic paralysis. Japan still possessed battleships, cruisers, carriers, on paper a formidable fleet, but fuel reserves had dropped below 10% of operational requirements. Ships couldn't leave port. Those that did operated under strict fuel rationing, limiting speed, maneuverability, and combat effectiveness. The submarine USS Archerfish demonstrated the ultimate irony on November 29, 1944. The brand-new Japanese carrier Shinano, largest carrier ever built, supposedly unsinkable, was sailing from Yokosuka to Kure for final fittings when Archerfish's torpedoes struck. Shinano sank in 7 hours. She'd been at sea for exactly 17 hours. Her crew hadn't even completed damage control training because fuel shortages meant they couldn't conduct proper shakedown cruises. The Imperial Navy had become a museum. Beautiful ships, magnificent engineering, all frozen in place because the arteries were dry. Submarine commanders began reporting fewer targets, not because they'd achieved total victory, but because Japanese ships simply stopped sailing. The convoys thinned to a trickle. The sea lanes went quiet. In the silent service, they understood what it meant. The Japanese Navy hadn't been destroyed in glorious combat. It had been starved into irrelevance. The war continued, but the Pacific belonged to America now. The final revelation came in April 1945 during Operation Tengo, the Yamato's suicide mission to Okinawa. The largest battleship ever constructed, the symbol of Japanese naval power, was sent on a one-way mission with only enough fuel to reach the target. No fuel for return, no fuel for evasion, just enough to die fighting. This wasn't strategy, this was desperation wearing strategy's uniform. American intelligence intercepted the orders. Submarines weren't even dispatched to hunt Yamato. Why waste torpedoes? The U.S. Navy sent carrier aircraft instead. On April 7, 1945, wave after wave of bombers and torpedo planes attacked Yamato in open water. She fought beautifully, her anti-aircraft guns blazing, her massive turrets tracking targets to the last moment. But she couldn't maneuver aggressively, couldn't run at full speed, couldn't employ the tactical flexibility her designers had built into her. Not enough fuel. Yamato capsized after 2 hours of sustained attack, taking 2,747 men with her. The largest battleship ever built died not because she wasn't powerful enough, but because she couldn't dance. And in that moment, the entire brutal truth crystallized. Japan's Navy hadn't lost to better ships or braver sailors. It lost to empty tanks and severed supply lines. The submarines that won the war without firing a shot at the ships that mattered most. By the summer of 1945, the numbers told a story more devastating than any battle report. American submarines had sunk 1,314 Japanese merchant ships, including 276 tankers. 52% of all Japanese tanker tonnage lay at the bottom of the Pacific. The oil that fueled Pearl Harbor, that powered the conquest of Southeast Asia, that fed the Zero fighters over China, it never made it home. Japanese fuel imports dropped from 5 million barrels per month in 1943 to less than 300,000 barrels by July 1945, a 94% reduction. The synthetic fuel programs couldn't compensate. The hoarded reserves couldn't last. The Imperial Navy, once the third most powerful maritime force on Earth, was reduced to burning pine root oil, literally distilled from tree stumps to keep essential vessels operational. Pilots received shortened training, ships remained in port, Factories slowed production. The ultimate irony: Japan possessed the raw materials in occupied territories. They controlled the refineries. They had the technical expertise, but they couldn't transport the oil across water they no longer controlled. The American submarine force, never more than 2% of the U.S. Navy, had achieved what battleships and carriers alone could not: complete strategic strangulation. Silent, efficient, total. The submarine campaign's casualty rate was the highest of any American military branch. 52 submarines lost, 3,505 submariners killed, a 22% fatality rate. They paid in blood for every tanker they sunk, every convoy they ambushed, every torpedo they fired. The underwater war was claustrophobic terror punctuated by explosive violence. Depth charges that crushed hulls. Equipment failures at fatal depths. Carbon dioxide poisoning during extended submersion. But they accomplished something unprecedented in military history. They destroyed an empire's will to fight by destroying its ability to move. Japan surrendered in August 1945 with fuel reserves measured in days, not months. When the final tally was completed, historians calculated that without the submarine campaign, the Pacific War would have lasted at least another year, possibly two. The projected casualties from that extended conflict: millions more dead, both military and civilian. The mathematics were brutal but undeniable. Every tanker sunk saved lives by shortening the war. Every gallon of oil denied to Japan meant fewer kamikaze attacks, fewer island invasions, fewer cities burned. The submariners who survived carried those numbers quietly. They didn't talk much about the war. They'd done what was necessary, seen things no one should see, and accepted that victory sometimes looks like drowning men in burning oil. They made peace with ghosts by remembering the alternative. After the war, military strategists studied the submarine campaign with almost religious intensity. It became the template for modern naval doctrine: control the supply lines, not just the battle space. The lesson echoed through every conflict that followed. In the Cold War, Soviet submarine strategy explicitly mirrored American tactics from 1944. Modern carrier groups dedicate enormous resources to protecting supply ships. Satellite surveillance tracks fuel convoys in real time. The forgotten trick became foundational truth: wars are won in logistics chains as much as battlefields. But there's a darker legacy, one submariner veterans rarely discussed. They'd proven that modern warfare could methodically dismantle an enemy through economic strangulation. Clean on paper, devastating in practice. The men who burned in tanker oil, the crews who drowned in exploding cargo holds, they weren't soldiers in the traditional sense. They were mechanics, engineers, ordinary sailors moving fuel from point A to point B. And they died by the thousands because they'd become military targets by virtue of what they carried. The submarine commanders understood this moral complexity. They'd destroyed an enemy navy without glory, won a war without honor in the traditional sense. They'd done the mathematics of death and decided the equation justified the cost. History remembers them as heroes who saved millions. They remembered themselves as men who'd become very good at sinking ships full of people. Today, the wrecks of Japanese tankers lie scattered across the Pacific floor, silent monuments to a strategy so effective it changed naval warfare forever. Recreational divers occasionally find them. Oil drums still intact, engine rooms frozen in time, personal effects scattered in the silt. Nature has reclaimed them. Coral growing on torpedo damage, fish schools sheltering in cargo holds that once carried the Empire's lifeblood. The submarines that hunted them are mostly scrapped now. A few survive as museum ships: USS Bowfin in Pearl Harbor, USS Pampinito in San Francisco, steel corridors polished clean of war, plaques explaining what happened in sanitized language. School children walk through them on field trips, touching periscopes, imagining adventure. But the veterans who served knew better. They knew that war's greatest victories sometimes happen in silence, that empires can die not with thunder but with quiet mathematics, that the most effective weapon isn't always the most powerful. Sometimes it's simply the one aimed at the right vulnerability. They broke Japan's navy without dramatic duels or heroic last stands. They did it with patience, intelligence, and the brutal recognition that steel giants are only as strong as the fuel in their tanks. If this story revealed something you'd never known about how wars are really won, share it, because the most powerful strategies are usually the ones history barely whispers. Every event, number, and character in this documentary has been verified through historical and documented sources. In the silence that followed, empires learned that oceans have throats, and throats can be cut.